Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Igniting Change from the Ground Up, Uplifting Best Practices for Community Organizing and Leadership Engagement, presented by Prevention Institute and a number of other partners. My name is Laquana Williams, and I am an Associate Program Manager with Prevention Institute, and I am joined by my colleague, Maureen Silva, who will also be walking us through the first couple of slides. Next slide. We are so excited that our guest presenters will be joining us today. We'll be hearing from Alicia Brown, who is the Senior Vice President of the Foundation for Sustainable Urban Communities. And we've been working closely with Alicia and the Foundation to support their Be Well Block Captain initiative. This initiative is a collaborative model that builds the capacity of resident leaders to educate community members on what's important and relevant to their health topics. They also serve as education liaisons who help foster and build healthier communities. Additionally, we're really excited to have Martin Richards, who is the Executive Director for the Community Farm Alliance. Martin will be talking about their approach to grassroots organizing to support and create real systematic change for family farmers in Kentucky, using strategies that build democracy, create good public policy, and aid in community development. Next slide. To put our talk today in context, I'd like to first share a bit with you about our organization, Prevention Institute. We are a national organization based in California, and we have a broad range of staff expertise from violence prevention, mental health, healthcare, nutrition, and land use planning. But no matter the expertise of any given PI staff, we all have something in common that brought us to Prevention Institute. Each of us observed through our own professional and sometimes personal experiences that to be truly effective in advancing health and safety, our collective multi-sector approach is needed to go beyond a focus on the individual and to also move upstream. So together as an organization, our objective is to really grapple with the difficult questions. Questions like, how do we do quality prevention that prevents illness and injury in the first place? What are the most impactful strategies for achieving prevention and health equity? And how do we do prevention work in a way that recognizes how interrelated health and safety issues are? In other words, how do we break down the silos? So we answer these questions by tracking the research and providing training and coaching to multiple groups and sectors, and by communicating promising strategies that emerge from our community initiatives. Our goal essentially is to create tools, frameworks, trainings, and publications that build the capacity of the field to expand their prevention efforts, to incorporate a comprehensive environmental approach. Next slide. Because of our extensive work with communities across the nation, we've been able to glean lessons learned and integrate best practices to inform multiple bodies of work that aim to advance community health. One of the things we've heard a lot lately is the need to build authentic community engagement, organizing, and leadership into all of the work to make meaningful change. And so that's really at the heart of what we'll be diving in today. Today, our objectives include describing strategies and principles for cultivating authentic community engagement, highlighting best practices from both rural and urban communities on the community organizing and resident leadership, and then identifying action-oriented strategies that support policy and systems change rooted in partnership. Next slide. So how do we define community? We all have varying definitions of community, and it's really important that we first understand what community truly means before we can talk about engaging and organizing residents to advance health and equity. On the next slide, we have a more formal definition for you. Community is both a feeling and a set of relationships among people. People form and maintain communities to meet common needs. Members of the community have a sense of trust, belonging, safety, and caring for each other. They have an individual and collective sense that they can, as part of that community, influence their environments and each other. This definition is from David M. Chavez and Keen Lee, and it defines what we mean when we talk about community. We understand that to be successful in any initiative aimed to improve community health, it needs to be informed by the people, the culture, and the history that tell the story about that community. Next slide. So that leads us to community participation. And the definition here says that when it's real, it is your main investment in accountability. it's your main investment in sustainability. And that community participation is when truly you involve people in creating a mechanism for themselves to define change. So based on this example, we can see what happens when we not only understand the community as a key entity that can influence individuals and in turn the people as a whole, and the social fabric that makes up those communities, but also when we recognize the immense value of community participation in this process, it adds value to the work. We understand the value in having participation from community, and at the same time, we need to ensure that we are engaging community in a real and authentic way. So for instance, if a healthcare agency and a coalition are interested in developing a farmer's market to increase fruit and vegetable access among their community, they too need to also be thinking about the location of the market, what foods are culturally appropriate to sell there, and the vendors that the community would be most interested in supporting that would increase foot traffic and social connectedness. Questions like these are only answered by engaging community as part of the process, which in turn leads to more effectiveness and sustainability. With that, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague Maureen Silva, who will walk us through the remainder of the slides by first talking to you about transformational engagement.
Thank you so much, Laquana. So I think some of the pieces that Laquana queued up is, as we look at a range of engagement practices, we know that there's this really important frame around moving from transactional to transformational community engagement. We attribute this frame to Voices for Racial Justice, which is an organization we worked with recently as part of a project with support from the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. Prevention Institute worked with a number of organizational leaders working in grassroots, working in base building organizations, as well as community-based agencies, and we asked them to share their experiences and ideas about many of the skills, the strengths, even some of the limitations that they were feeling around effectively working with public health agencies on initiatives that were working to eliminate health inequities. And so one of the things that actually came up from community groups is that when health departments come into communities and provide information about an issue simply to collect feedback on their own terms and then return to their offices, it can sometimes lead to a transactional versus transformational community engagement experience. And we hear sometimes that this type of transactional community engagement process can feel like, a checkbox item. And this isn't every single case, but overall, transactional community engagement can result in a disconnection from community members and often frustration with predetermined limitations on the type of input, feedback, as well as leadership community members can contribute. Transformational community engagement, on the other hand, seeks to positively change the dynamics between public health agencies and community members. When we think about transformational engagement efforts, we know that it makes space for opportunities for residents to lead and sometimes co-lead sustainable initiatives that impact residents' own livelihoods. So building skills, carving out leadership and decision-making roles, and creating opportunities for deep listening about residents' experiences and priorities can support the shift that we want to see from a one-dimensional transactional engagement to transformative community engagement. And we have the opportunity to work with groups across the country. And one example of a community that has been intentional about building transformational community engagement into their work is the Student Education Empowerment Development Squad, also known as SEEDS. It's a little bit easier to pronounce, which is out of a rural area in Central California. In 2010, Prevention Institute facilitated a training to staff from Cultiva la Salud, which is a leadership development organization representing Central Valley communities in California. And after they attended a training hosted by Prevention Institute, they worked with 18 youth as part of SEEDS in a town called Planada, which is an unincorporated town of about 2,400 or so people in the Central Valley region of California. And these young people went out and began to photograph their community. They used these photos to start a conversation about what's going on in Planada, how community determinants of health are really impacting folks' livelihoods and identify where to focus their efforts first. And in that effort, they chose safe routes to school. They decided that a zone in school areas that doubled speeding fines would actually dissuade speeding by schools and would also help raise money for safer infrastructure, such as sidewalks, for instance. And they kept working. They built awareness of their ideas through having a table at a transportation forum where they displayed the photos they had taken with streetscape designs, which depicted safer, greener options for Planada. The youth work ended up swaying a county supervisor to get the planners to actually do something and identify steps to improve community determinants. Seeds also wrote opinion pieces, or at least the youth did as part of this effort, and they presented to their county board of supervisors. They also testified before the California Senate Transportation and Housing Committee and worked on a Caltrans Environmental Justice Transportation Planning Grant. So this photo here is one I think that's pretty near and dear to Prevention Institute. This is of our statewide policy advocacy day called ENACT Day. This is an event that Prevention Institute puts on every year, or most years at least, with state and local partners. And in the center here, the young gentleman speaking is Jonathan Hernandez, and he was one of the workshop participants. On the state capitol steps, Jonathan, who at the time was about 14 years old, talked about the need for a safe routes to school bill. He himself lived just a few blocks away and didn't have any sidewalks, crossing lanes, or slower speed zones in his neighborhood. And he often took his chances when crossing a major road on his way to school. And he talked about this on the Capitol steps and just mentioned that when he's late and there's lots of cars, it could mean detention, or even worse, he's risking his own safety. So until this experience, he hadn't had the opportunity to be an advocate in this way for his own community. In the end, the County Board of Supervisors approved the pedestrian improvement plan. The state legislature passed a law increasing the fine for traffic violations in and around school zones. And even though it was vetoed by the governor that year, participants reapproached the next legislative session with some reworked language to the bill. So we can see from this example that I just provided an overview of that so many other community initiatives really rely on the community experience. We need to showcase the history, the relationships, priorities, the needs, and so on. And this needs to be the central point for creating health and equity in a real way. So here are some key principles that help us do this. Partnerships with communities experiencing health and safety inequities are strengthened by prioritization of an equitable process. As many of us know or may have even experienced, engagement strategies can sometimes feel oriented toward bringing together residents, providing information, and then collecting feedback to strengthen these public health initiatives. And in these cases, a key opportunity exists for community-based organizations to be established as a co-designer and implementer along with public health agencies and other institutions. When the public is there, there's an investment of meaningful mechanisms for community engagement, like empowering the community to establish these priorities, as we saw with the SEEDS example, leading implementation efforts, and this can positively contribute to changing leadership and power dynamics beyond any one initiative, project, or institution alone. Secondly, community engagement efforts that provide space for identifying root causes of inequities builds trust and fosters long-term relationships. Due to a lot of historical trauma and continued imbalances in racial and class power, we know that there's this inherent distrust between community members and public health agencies. Longtime organizers have emphasized the need to develop a shared understanding of this context and make space to name these tensions and conflict before attempting to just jump into any exchange. And then thirdly, collaboration that identifies and compensates community partners, fairly acknowledging contributions, helped build equity into institutional practices. So some funding streams from federal agencies are often allocated to governmental health institutions to then re-grant to local and non-governmental groups. This approach can help strengthen some of the ties between groups. However, there are some times when this could reinforce the perception of a top-down approach to partnership in which the governmental agency is in charge while the community-based organizations are in turn grantees. So ensuring that partnerships are resourced both in terms of skills and funding to establish infrastructure, as well as practices and policies that treat each partner as equals in design and decision making, is really the way to put leadership into practice rather than just principle. So I want to close this out, at least for some of the pieces that Prevention Institute is covering today, with an example from San Diego, California. And this is from United Women of East Africa, also known as UWEAF. This is a project of our Making Connections initiative, which is a national initiative that's funded by the Movember Foundation, where we're working to advance community mental health and well-being with a particular focus on men and boys of color, as well as veterans. This community is one of the largest communities of East African refugees in the United States today. They have individuals and families that have been coming to the U.S. because they are essentially, needing to because of war and trauma in their home countries. And many of the refugees are mothers and their children. Oftentimes, the fathers end up staying because they're fighting in the war or they've been injured or killed in their home country. And as you can begin to imagine, when this kind of rolls out, children and mothers are suffering from a lot of trauma. And on top of that, they traditionally have been offered very little services. So as a result, many refugee families, especially young boys, have dealt with mental health issues that aren't easily recognized or talked about in their community and have higher rates of substance abuse and incarceration. It wasn't until the loss of 5 young men in a string of suicides that really propelled the community into action to kind of think about, what do we do about this issue? During the first planning and assessment year, the organization engaged and recruited a small cohort of young men from the East African community to identify what they need to change and what they needed to do differently. And they did this by surveying the community. These young men figured out what the strategies needed to look like that would make sense for their community, and then figured out the different topical areas. These same young men, who are now mentors of young boys, have stayed in the project partly because the organization and its partners had worked really hard to build their trust and their families' trust over the years. In fact, many of the coalitions are actually run by mothers and women of the East African community, so partnership has been really crucial. United Women in East Africa created a drop-in wellness center and hub that young men can now come into and utilize regularly from these efforts. The center has a storytelling unit, as well as games and lots of other activities that connect people together. The center also brings in other groups and services to talk to young people, including a member of the community that works for an employment agency. There's a number of mental health professionals that talk to young men, and they recently offered an advocacy and leadership training so that when the opportunity came up to talk to County Board of Supervisors around a housing policy, they were actually ready and were able to talk to the Board of Supervisors. So there were a number of lessons learned, gleaned from this process, but I wanted to highlight a few today that has to do with community-focused strategy. And one of them here is community conditions form the basis for an actionable prevention approach. Jama Mohammed, the Making Connections site coordinator for United Women of East Africa, who was born in Somalia and came to the United States as a refugee when he was just about 12 years old, said something that really speaks to this notion. He said, suicide is rare back home. Over here, it's a different environment. It has to do with the tremendous stress. And to help kind of address some of these issues, the Thrive Community Clusters, which is a Prevention Institute tool, they found they're interrelated and mutually reinforcing. The Thrive tool that outlines a set of community factors can be tailored for each community and provides a foundation for how to articulate and prioritize the community determinants of health. And then another important lesson learned is a focus on community conditions provides a mechanism to address and reduce stigma. It helps move us from thinking only about the individual rather than entire communities that have historically and in the present day experienced trauma that has shaped their health and well-being. And when we start moving from this individual lens, we then have a focus on community conditions that provides an opportunity to move beyond traditional treatment models. So I wanted to just kind of flash some questions that I think are really important for community-based organizations, local public health departments, foundations, and beyond to think about as they're looking at transformational community engagement. Are those most affected by the issue actively involved in defining the problem and shaping the solution? Are we using techniques that build community capacity and leadership? And if not, what techniques should we really look at and pursue? What barriers to community engagement, including our perception and history in the community, should we consider? And lastly, what can we do differently to improve or enhance community engagement? What's our actual plan that we're putting in place to implement those changes? Many of the points we touched on were tailored from this paper, Partnering for Health Equity, that was made possible because of support from W.K. Kellogg Foundation. We highlighted challenges the grassroots organizations and health agencies we talk to face. And in this paper, we start to articulate some of the structural factors, organizational practices, and ways of being able to navigate partnership and community engagement that have actually facilitated grassroots organizations and health agencies in being better able to work together to advance health equity. So we just wanted to kind of flash this report. It's on our website. We encourage you to take a look at this resource when you have some time. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Alicia Brown to talk through the Be Well model and give a little bit more information on this initiative of the Stapleton Foundation.
Hello, this is Alicia Brown. I am the Senior Vice President of the Stapleton Foundation and the Director of our Be Well Health and Wellness Initiative. I am going to be presenting on uplifting best practices for community organizing and leadership engagement. Next slide. That's just more information about me. So, Be Well is an on-the-ground movement of communities coming together to take charge of their health and wellness. The mission of Be Well is to affect programs, policies, and practices to create health equality and access for all people. Our vision is for a culture in which all people have an equal opportunity to achieve the health that they desire, regardless of their race, income, gender, or location, and we often say any other social circumstance. Be Well functions in Denver, Colorado, as well as Aurora, Colorado, in 6 different neighborhoods. The neighborhoods are about approximately 100,000 people, and this is just a snapshot of what the area looks like that we serve. We are led by a community collaborative, and that community collaborative is basically a multi-sector coalition that consists of residents and community members, residents and community stakeholders, healthcare, folks from the healthcare industry, housing, development, education, transportation, churches, businesses, and various other organizations, as well as our city officials and elected officials. We have them as a part of our coalition as well, and they kind of oversee the work of the Be Well Health and Wellness Initiative. And on this next slide, it kind of gives you an idea of the types of collaborators that we have in the Be Well Collaborative. So one of the things that we really focus on is advancing health equity through community engagement. And so our goal is to build the capacity of communities to, we think it's essential to advancing health equity. And community leaders and residents think about, oh, I lost my place here. So the idea is that we build the capacity of our residents. It's essential for us to be able to advance health equity. And the way that we do that is through making community leaders and residents help them become more educated about disparities in their community. We bring them together to bring all of the multiple stakeholders together, an interest in health equity, to kind of have dialogue among one another about the opportunities that they see. We really focus on opportunities and try our best to ensure that once we think of all of the challenges, that we uplift solutions. And the last thing that we really think about in stakeholder engagement is around engaging our decision makers in those discussions and working with those decision makers to consider the community collaborative or our stakeholders' perspectives when they're making decisions for our community. And so we really try to focus in those areas as we move forward. In the next slide, you'll see some of the strategies that we use to engage the community. And so inclusive participation, this is really characterized by us partnering with groups or individuals that others may not be aware of or have access to. The idea is that a lot of times we work with organizations or we work with leaders that say, you know, we really want to work and be in the community, but we don't know how to engage them. And so we try our best to identify those groups that are often isolated, like seniors or youth, even groups like homeless, folks that might be homeless. We try to engage all that we can in these discussions because we feel that those who are most impacted are very capable of working with us to create solutions. The other is civic engagement. We really work with the community members to really understand their role in civic engagement, what roles they play in policy and system level improvement, ways for them to inform opportunities, just really so that they can become fully active in their communities. A lot of times we have these processes and these systems, and community members their day-to-day life is not engaging in these systems or knowing how to engage in these systems. And oftentimes they can get left behind. And so we really try to focus on how can we effectively get our community members to be civically involved, but also how can we work with our communities to help them to become some of those decision makers. So then we also provide health education to talk about what it means to be healthy and how that relates to the social determinants of health, using trainings and information dissemination. We feel like it's essential to helping our community members overcome their skepticism and their opinions once they build their capacity in these areas as well. In terms of our Be Well Way, that is a program that we have and for which we really think about what do we need to do in the 6-neighborhood area of 100,000 people to really engage the people that we're working with? How do we meet people exactly where they are? And so we go to Little League practices, we might go to bus stops, we might go to grocery stores, we do door-to-door outreach. We go to churches, we go to schools, we host what we call healthy happy hours. These are ways in which people can really engage without feeling like they're going outside of their everyday life. The whole purpose is for us to meet people where they are and not make it difficult for them to be involved. We try to find clear pathways for participation, and we're also very open to the community suggestions. Community members are very good at telling you, the best place to reach them and how they would like to be engaged. So working with the community, and we can go to the next slide, working with the community, we really put together what we call our Be Well Block Captain program. And this program really did stem from several conversations with community members to better understand how do we engage our community in a way that is effective and genuine and authentic to really have them sit in the seat as decision makers for the decisions, policy systems, and environments that impact their everyday lives. So our Be Well Block Captains are lay residents from our communities who are on the ground. They're knocking on doors. They have the intent of improving their own health and the health of their community. They really take what they've learned in the Be Well Block Captain training out to their communities and share it with their fellow community members. They really learn and talk about the social determinants of health, and we don't use that kind of language in the community, so they break that down and really describe what that means and how that really impacts communities. Next slide. And so we established tiers because our block captains are very active in their communities and they do a lot of different things, but everyone is not capable or has the time to fully commit to being a block captain at a very high level. So we wanted to provide some different opportunities, and this is based on community feedback and community structure. So we have several different tiers within the community that will allow people to participate in the way that they can. We understand that people have a busy life, and so we had to create a structure within the Be Well Block Captain program that gives volunteers the opportunity to engage. So those structures are our connector level, our captain level, and our coach level. So the connector level is for those who say, we don't have a whole lot of time, but we're very happy to pass out information and to participate in meetings 3 times a year to really understand what Be Well is, to really understand and continue to receive information about our community, and to really learn about how we can influence and get involved with the civic engagement process. We have the captain level. That's where our Be Well Block captains participate in a 16.5-hour training over 4 weeks. They work with us to learn everything from how to lead healthy lives themselves, to address the various social determinants, as well as how to address the various social determinants of health through policy systems and environmental changes. And they also do and work on projects within their communities that they have identified as opportunities to advance health equity. And then we have our coaches. Our coaches are those block captains who are able to train and work with other block captains in the community as well. So the training does not become that of the Foundation for Sustainable Urban Communities, but is actually, though, it belongs to the community, and they take ownership of it and lead that training so that they are teaching and sharing what they learn with their fellow block captains and with those that are in our community. So our coaches really take a lead role in going and helping to ensure that we always have a core of block captains. Next slide. So the Be Well Way training series meets the needs of participants with an interest in discussing and learning about ways to improve their individual and community health through civic engagement. A specific focus is placed on health disparities and the social determinants of health within the context listed above. And that just tells you how it's a capacity-focused approach. We really try to think about how we're building our own capacity because we feel like we learn just as much from the community, as well as building the capacity of our community members. Every training is a different, takes on a different dynamic because people are different, neighborhoods are different, and there's never a one-size-fits-all approach. And so we might tailor the syllabus for the training based on what we hear from community members in those communities that we're serving. We might change the way we deliver the training. So it really just depends on where we are. And then the training supports residents to seek seeking to create positive and meaningful improvements. And it also helps residents to actively contribute to their health and wellness and that of their families, friends, and neighbors and communities. Next slide. Again, the training sessions were developed in response to community members, requests through surveys, focus groups, and key informant interviews. We also used a lot of data collected. We did a Taking Neighborhood Health to Heart community-based participatory research study in partnership with the University of Colorado Department of Family Medicine. Now, we realized that all of our communities won't be able to do that. It was 900 door-to-door surveys, focus groups, key informant interviews. We did that. We were fortunate enough to receive that grant, so that really drove, and that's how the VWEL Block Captain program was established. But now that we have that, we're in a position where we can share that. And so we have some core sessions that we include in the training, but again, we can tailor this approach to be what is necessary for those in the communities that we're serving. And so we have the orientation first. We do a session on heart health and chronic disease, nutrition and physical activity, and then managing your mental load. So then we kind of transition and talk about what are the impacts of your health? Like, how does being healthy impact you as a person in your community? And we really start to try to tie community, your health, and policies and systems in the environment together for folks. And then we talk about the built environment, and we go into civic engagement strategies. So the ideal here is that each session builds upon one another. And at the end, our community members start to think about, okay, what does this mean for my community, and how are there projects, are there ways in which we can work with my community to advance equity? And we start to define a project that the community members will work on over the next year, and some of them are longer-term projects that our communities have worked on. And so the next slide is just an example of some of the work that we've done based on the engagement of our Block captains and how we've really worked to advance equity. So a particular example is that in Northeast Denver, physical inactivity is a risk factor for poor health outcomes, particularly among African Americans. The Regional Transportation District recently opened a fast track, which is 122 miles of commuter rail and light rail stations. Our VWEL Block captains and our community collaborative wanted to ensure that access to transit was easy for members of the target neighborhoods, and that the best practices were employed to improve access to the new system. Basically, they wanted to ensure that those who were most vulnerable could access this new commuter rail system. The East Line is the line that really serves our target neighborhood, and our Block captains partnered with RTD to bring facts about the new rail line to the community, to discuss the connection between public transportation and increasing physical activity, and also inform the community on how to engage in civic processes to really share their concerns about the lack of connections to the commuter rail system. And also, they educated the RTD officials on the need for ease for pedestrians and for bicycle access. So we hosted 6 community conversations. We established a formal partnership with the RTD stakeholder group. We worked with RTD to present preliminary plans to the stakeholder groups to review prior to their implementation. And our VWEL Block captains provided input on all the plans that were produced by the Regional Transportation District. So as a result of that, a route that was deemed to be cut was continued with a slight reduction in service, but the route was continued, and they added an additional route that still that helped to pick up the slack of that reduction in service. Routes were added in 4 in one of our communities, and RTD is also partnering with us to host these Know Your Route seminars, We are working with them to ensure that everybody knows the best route for them to know where they want to go. So our block captains go with RTD officials out into the communities to different locations, to some of those places that we talked about before, apartments, little league football practices, our practices. Those are huge here in Colorado. And so we partner with them to do those Know Your Route seminars. And so we've seen significant successes in terms of our residents riding and utilizing RTD, as well as them being willing to walk through the different stops, etc. Another example is on how we have increased physical activity is through our Denver Parks and Recreation Centers. Our recreation centers, we have 27 recreation centers located across the city, but there were barriers that existed that kept residents, primarily and predominantly African American and Latino communities, from wanting to use the recreation centers for physical activity or anything else for that matter. We learned of these barriers through a series of what we call healthy happy hours, where we engage residents in physical activity conversations by providing information on the benefits of physical activity, sharing data on how the lack of physical activity is impacting African Americans and the Latino community, and offering physical activity demonstrations. The healthy happy hours were all held in natural community gathering places such as community rooms located in the community and stores, in affordable housing complexes or churches, and in the actual recreation centers. Again, we're meeting people where they are to ensure that we're able to capture their input. What we learned was there were limited or no physical activity classes offered in the recreation centers that people were interested in participating in, and some had none at all. The classes that were offered were not culturally sensitive in the rec centers where there were classes or opportunities. In a lot of the recreation center, there were like foosball machines and that kind of thing, but there was nothing where folks could really be physically active. And our recreation department went to a tiered system. So, of course, all the lower level tiered recreation centers offered the least amount of services. Previously, our organizations from the community were able to come in and utilize the recreation center to offer fitness classes, et cetera, that were more conducive to physical activity, but also that were more culturally appropriate. But there was no uniformity on how these organizations could apply to access the centers. The group became frustrated with the differing processes and just stopped partnering with Denver Parks and Rec altogether because there was so much red tape. And so we started working with Parks and Recreation, the Be Well Health and Wellness Initiative, along with our residents, to find out how we can continue to have these wonderful partnerships with community members who are professionals that want to give back to their community, but they're frustrated with the process by which they would have to be able to do it. And so as a result of that, we, again, completed Healthy Happy Hours, but this time we did them a little differently. We brought our decision makers in so that they could hear and see how the residents were what they were interested in. We also did a health impact assessment collectively with our Denver Parks and Recreation and our partners in the community, as well as our residents. We also knew that in 2014, and this all happened in 2017 and 28, or between 2014 and 2018, but we also knew that the city auditor had completed a report, and in his recommendations, he said that there needed to be some type of standard partnership policy created and implemented within Denver Parks and Recreation. A standard partnership policy in this case is similar to a joint use agreement in that it is intended to allow partners to provide services when the recreation center facilities are not being used. And so we really worked to get this standard partnership policy put in place. And after being able to test the standard partnership policy for the last 3 years, our Parks and Recreation Department is literally adopting a standard partnership policy this year in 2018 to be implemented in the coming year so that organizations are able to provide services that they cannot provide for whatever reason, whether it be the funding or whatever the case may be, and to allow organizations to kind of help to build opportunities within our recreation centers. And so after sharing our data in that report, we were successful in getting a partnership policy in place. And we also now have representation on our Parks Advisory Board for residents in the community. So they're becoming community member or decision makers in their communities. They are also working with City Council to serve as a liaison to keep them informed on what they think the progress is in our community in terms of providing equitable resources across our recreation center system. And we're working with the City and County of Denver to really replicate our process in other areas in the community. So with any project, and we can go to the next slide, with any project, it always comes with its challenges. And one of our challenges was really knowing that wins are slow. Relationships take time, policies and system improvements take time. But in our case, we also ran into some challenges due to some of the organizational and political changes. In the recreation center example that I gave you, in the middle of our recreation center campaign, we had a change in leadership actually too. And so we had to build new relationships that we hadn't previously had before. It was an appointed director, and sometimes those appointments change. And so because of that, we had to kind of be flexible and work with and build another relationship. But it caused residents to become frustrated and in some cases to lose hope. And you really need that on the ground capacity, because those are the folks who are impacted. Those are the people who will use the services once they have been established. And so we have to definitely work with them, because those are also the folks that our community members, our decision makers will listen to. The other thing is that folks get burnt out. They get burnt out from too many meetings, duplicating efforts, competing priorities. It's very challenging to keep people engaged. And one of the ways that we've been able to keep folks engaged is to really provide recognition. We also, for our block captains, do provide a small incentive, depending on the tier that they're at. It's $50 or $25, just kind of for gas money. But recognition goes a long way. So we typically have a budget for the incentives monthly that we never really max, because we have so many residents that say, oh no, we'll just take that and donate it back to the program, or we're going to donate it to somebody else who may need it a little more. And we just want some type of recognition. We put them in the paper. We do interviews with them. Even with this presentation, typically when we do presentations similar to this, we have our residents work with us to do the presentations, and they like that because it builds their capacity as well. And so they're able to share their experiences with others. And so we do that. We try to provide recognition in a variety of different ways. The other thing that we do is ensure that we engage them in the building of the program, so that they take ownership of it and they want to see the program keep going. And with our residents, we try to work with our decision makers in our community collaborative to find out what is everybody's agenda in the beginning. And once we know, what do you want to achieve, and are these things going to align, we try to make sure that our community organizations, et cetera, have the opportunity to meet their goals and their needs too, as it is in alignment with the goals of us advancing equity in our community. Lastly, because we have been in the community so long and our residents have done such a great job in working with us to implement the Be Well Black Captain program, and we can move to the next slide, we have been able to establish the Be Well Black Captain how-to guide and toolkit. While we realize you cannot do community organizing in a box, we are very happy to share with you the strategies that we have used, as well as evaluations and tools. We don't feel like you can evaluate this work in the same way that you would evaluate a traditional program. And so we have learned over the years in implementing the Be Well Black Captain program how to measure its effectiveness. And so we have all of those tools and templates that we have established, along with a guide to really demonstrate or help people to establish this type of network within their communities that is authentic, that is from the ground up, that the community takes ownership of, so that if the foundation or Be Well is not in these communities anymore, they can still continue to build upon their successes. The next slide I just wanted to show, is really kind of hard to read, is kind of how we set up the technical assistance that we're also willing to provide with our how-to guide. Again, community building in a box is not necessarily possible, but we're happy to come out and to provide what we've learned. And so this is just kind of how we have established the Be Well Black Captain training, where we train organizations and work with organizations to establish either the Be Well Black Captain community engagement model or a way to do community engagement around a particular project or activity. We always encourage you to establish these relationships early on, so that when a project or anything of that nature comes up, you already have the relationship. An example of how we have implemented the Be Well Black Captain Toolkit is in rural Colorado. Northwest Colorado Health is replicating the Be Well Black Captain program in Steamboat Springs, Craig County. The program engages our residents in identifying the root causes of disparities and uplifts resident-driven solutions to address these challenges. A couple of things as a result of the Northwest Colorado Health Network learning the Be Well Black Captain program and establishing a Be Well Black Captain program of their own is that they were able to advocate for the approval of property taxes that help fund affordable housing in the area. So they were able to use some of the property taxes to help fund some affordable housing. And you may not be as familiar with this area, but it's a mountainous area that's rural, and a lot of the folks that work at these resorts could not even live in the area. So we were able to get some funding there to have them be able to build some more affordable housing. The other thing is, in partnership with the Colorado Mountain College, we were able to advance workforce development to train mechanics and provide certification to community residents who complete the program. So a new certification program, again, based solely on the effort of our Be Well Black Captain. With our refugee community, the Asian Pacific Development Center, we were able to improve transit services, enroll our refugee community members in Medicaid, and engage our residents and renters' rights sessions to better understand their housing contracts and what their rights are in terms of that. Our refugee population was often overlooked in terms of working with our affordable housing complexes, et cetera, but we were able to engage them in their conversations, and the landlords really changed and started to better listen to the refugees once they understood that they knew what their rights were. So sustainability. A good approach to sustaining the program is to consistently focus on building the knowledge, skills, and capacity of the block captains and stakeholders with whom they interact. We think this will ensure that there's a legacy of people who have actually been on the ground and have achieved their goals through strategies that they've learned in the program. Another thing, as the Block captains grow and become more sophisticated in their knowledge, their ability to influence and good health will grow. They also foster their continued education in ways that reinforce their successes. Remember that they will be the communicators, spreading the word, showing how effective lay outreach can be, building community health one block at a time. And the volunteers will benefit from some training related to building interpersonal communication skills and leadership training. Similar to any volunteer program, participants come and go. However, community health and organizing knowledge that participants receive from the Be Well Black Captain program is not lost if a participant takes a sabbatical from the program or retires. Be Well Black Captains maintain and continue to utilize, share the knowledge they have gained within their communities and or networks. In an effort to ensure that former Be Well Black Captains stay informed, we ask participants if they're willing to continue to receive information about Be Well projects and activities through newsletters, periodic emails, and other means of communication. These participants are also always strongly encouraged to attend our annual event, which is our Be Well Awards and Community Celebration. The other thing that we do, again, is really try to build their capacity and encourage them to serve on boards and commissions and committees in their community, because once they start to become further engaged, the less likely they are to stop volunteering, as long as they're appreciated and recognized. And so those are some of the ways that we really try to sustain the program. And then obviously we continue to seek funding and go after grants and use the funds that we've received through our technical services to really move to advance this program forward. In terms of lessons learned on the next slide, the best thing we could say is really do your homework in a community. Really think about the community before you go into the community, and know that you're not the expert, but that the community members are. As much as you can, ensure that your staff is diverse and can relate to the community you intend to serve. We think that we know that we have to enter communities humbly. We are not the expert. Our community members are again. Speak the community's language, not public health lingo. We oftentimes have words like social determinants of health that means nothing to the community. So really thinking about what that means and how some of the language we might use might not transfer to the community. Be willing to invest time, energy, resources, and in relationships, making sure that you're able to build those strong relationships. The other thing is a lot of times our communities are skeptical because they feel like we have an agenda that we haven't exposed. So the important thing there is to make sure you bring it all to the table, lay it all out, be transparent about why you're there, what you're doing, and that you are a professional and you're getting paid for this. And so we have to be completely transparent with our community. And then to be open and genuine. Communities know when folks are not telling the truth and that they're just in it for themselves. So be genuine and to be open. And then lastly is our communities are not laboratories. We can't go out there, strike up a deal, and then leave the community, get our research, do our data, implement our program, and then we're gone. Work with the community to create something that they can build their capacity to make it be ongoing for the long term. And lastly, it would be to really just be committed to our communities. We have done a lot of work in a lot of communities across Colorado, primarily our urban communities across Colorado, but we do have a lot of expertise that we've been able to explore in our rural communities, which you'll hear more about engaging the communities rurally from our next presenter. But I wanted to leave you with my information and just to encourage you to get in the zone. And that means get in the mindset of engaging the community prior to you going in with your own vision for what a community should be. So thank you for your attention, and I will transfer this over to Martin, our next presenter.
Thank you, Alicia. These concepts about community and best practices about community organizing and community engagement are really universal, whether they're in California or Colorado or in Kentucky. Next slide, please. So I'm often these days describe myself as a recovering farmer. I joined CFA a while back when I was transitioning our traditional cattle and tobacco farm into organics, and Community Farm Alliance had formed an organic farmer. And I came to the meeting and was hooked. Next slide. So CFA was formed during the farm crisis of the 1980s. Our members who formed the organization were tobacco and dairy farmers, and really the first thing they did was set up a suicide hotline for those farmers who were, in fear of losing their farms. And then the next thing was that they felt that crisis was largely created out of public policy. And, they felt that if public policy was going to have this kind of effect on their farms, their children and their future, they wanted a say in that. And so they created Community Farm Alliance to be that voice in public policy, whether it's in Frankfort, state capital of Kentucky, or in Washington. Next slide, please. So, fundamentally what we do is kind of represented in that graphic, is that, we organize at the grassroots level in order to address problems that people are having and to address them ultimately at the community level, but ultimately in the big picture. Next slide, please. So our mission has largely remained the same for these 33 years. We continue to tweak this vision depending on the kind of things that we are dealing with. But one of the things is that CFA is a grassroots membership-based organization. And so we have about 1,500 members across the state of Kentucky. And our membership, while initially was largely farmers in rural communities, today is much more representative of the entire state of Kentucky. So we're about, half rural, half urban. About half of our members are farmers. And so we continue to work to support those members. Next slide, please. At the heart of what we do is represented here in our theory of change. And so things have to start at the grassroots level, has to start with individual people, their families, the problems that they are encountering in their day-to-day life, and then take it to the community level. And then engaging that community, building consensus, building leadership, building collaboration, both within that community and, is more often the case, the next community over is dealing with very similar issues or problems, or the very root of the problem, which is often poverty and undemocratic systems. And so we build that collaboration across communities. Often we create model programs or model projects that, going back to our roots, provide direct services to our folks in those communities. But we do that in a way that we can then lift those models up either in Frankfort or Washington and say, hey, if you pass this piece of legislation, you make this appropriation, that what we have done here can be replicated across the state or across the nation. We always use a story-based communication strategy, using the voices at the grassroots level to lift those voices up to the policymakers. We have just found that is often the case as people are dismissive of, quote, experts, but rarely do they dismiss real people with real problems who've taken time out of their day to travel to Frankfurt or Washington and directly relay the problem. Next slide, please. So just another kind of graphic of what we do with combination of community organizing, direct service, leadership development, and at the heart of the intersection of all that work is to create system change across the board so that everybody can benefit from this. Next slide, please. So, what does it look like at the grassroots level? Well, it often looks like this. People coming together in some community center, putting ideas or problems up on the wall, folks, sharing their stories with each other. And, what we found is, those people who are most affected, go back, please. Those people who are most effective, they really know the problem well. And they often know the answer to that problem. Where they get kind of hung up is like what to do next. And that's where CFA comes in and helps them with that, with the organizing piece. And then, helping those who have that leadership potential in their community to help them have the confidence and the knowledge to step forward and be a face of that issue in their community, and often, take that face and that voice onward. Next slide, please. So again, often, with the things that programs and projects that we pilot directly help those communities, but then go on and serve as models. So, Community Farm Alliance started the first, farm to school program in one school district in Kentucky. Today the Department of Agriculture has a robust farm to school program. We continue to participate in that, but other things like, helping with rural and urban farmers markets and other different out of the box ways of doing marketing for farmers. Next slide, please. The other thing that we often do is, we take it to the streets. In this case, is that we CFA members were in front of Yum Brand headquarters in Louisville, advocating for a few pennies more for the immokalee workers who are picking those tomatoes. Next slide, please. We also, again, take it to the state capitol. Our members come to the Capitol, meet with legislators. As we haven't done a tractorcade through Main Street of Frankfurt in a while, although I think a lot of our folks would love to do that. But again, it's directly, bringing the grassroots in front of policymakers and letting them know what are the problems and what are the potential solutions. Next slide, please. So, and again, coming back to our theory of change, right, is ultimately what can a small nonprofit do? Well, if we can get public policy change, then we have, really started making system change. And so, just again, over these past 33 years, we have worked on 24 successful grassroots campaigns. Sometimes it's, supporting family farmers and those who depend on them. Sometimes and often it's, going up against the one size fits all model of policy that, supports, industrial agriculture, but, adversely affects family farmers. And so some of these policies are very specific about what a farmer can do. Often it can be a big picture stuff like House Bill 611, for instance. Next, please. So in our efforts about a decade ago to build farmers markets in the low-income communities of West Louisville that were largely people of color, we ran into issues of food access and hunger, food equity, those kind of things. I mean, it was, largely still is a food desert, and that was before that term was coined. But, I think for our farmers who are used to dealing with, say, tobacco companies and fighting against for justice and equity with the tobacco companies, it really resonated with our folks that here was communities and neighborhoods that were struggling just to put food on the table, let alone, nutritious food on the table. So, food security and food justice has been an integral part of CFA's work for over a decade. And so, we take that, and this diagram shows multiple levels of how we're dealing with that, including at the very center is the Kentucky Double Dollars program that we initiated about 4 years ago that doubles up food access programs at farmers markets. So that includes SNAP and seniors and WIC programs to increase that food access, but it also helps our farmers who we have helped transition again from tobacco to growing food. But it also includes numerous coalitions and other efforts to create a statewide movement building around these issues. Next slide, please. And part of movement building is how you frame problem. So for 25 years, we have been saying that agriculture and food system development is economic development. And it started coming through. So, the current mayor of Louisville, when he first ran, he used, local food development and food access as one of his platforms. And we've had now the second Commissioner of Agriculture who has also used local food system development as economic development. So it's great. People are getting that message. So now we've been kind of moving that forward and talk about, this intersection of food access and food nutrition and improving public health. And, having to frame it in terms of economic development, because often public officials say, yeah, that makes sense, right? People getting access to better, more nutritious food. But they really pay attention when you are able to put dollars and cents to that and say that, hey, we improve public health and, it offsets medical costs and absentee costs and other things like that. And our work with WellCare, who's a medical care insurance provider, and WellCare has been able to document, that, in fact, that when you invest upfront in improving access to nutritious food, it does pay off in the end for that. So we keep doing that. And now we're working on the Farm Bill, right? And SNAP is one of those programs that is unfortunately controversial in the Farm Bill, but, we're coming back and say, hey, SNAP is like, and Moody Analytics kind of verified it for us that, hey, SNAP is like one of the best economic development tools that there is going in our country. Next slide, please. So again, as you've already heard, some of the lessons and challenges, right? So you got to meet people where they are, and you got to build diversity in that. So Kentucky, we still are in many ways a rural state. We're about split, about half urban and half rural in our state. But, over the past, 50 years, structural racism has really affected Kentucky. And, we once had, robust farmers of color in the state, but that structural racism has really devastated those folks, and then, so today that largely, our populations of color are concentrated in urban areas. And so we really have to make an effort on CFA's end to be inclusive. And I'm so happy that our board this year has reconfirmed CFA's commitment to equity. So we're in the process of, drafting that up and focusing on how do we create a pathway for equity, for our strategic plan that's coming up. And, one of the things that, one of our past board presidents, Casa Heron, said, that whether you go any place in Kentucky, right, it may look different, but the end result is the hoods and the hollers still look very much alike in terms of the issues around poverty, food access, these kind of situations. So, I'm delighted where CFA is, the work that we're doing, the impact we're making, and looking forward. So next slide, and thank you all so much for giving us the opportunity to be part of this great discussion.
Thank you so much, Martin, as well as Alicia. I feel like both of you bring such a wealth of knowledge just around your work and engaging communities and doing a number of organizing activities. I wanted to close us out with, I think, this really important quote from Lupe Serrano with Casa de Esperanza. When you start with needs, you get programs. When you start with strengths, you get possibilities. And I think this quote really captures the essence of what we're talking about today. I wanted to leave you with a couple of our contact information from Prevention Institute. Martin and Alicia have their contact information on their slides. And this is the contact information for myself, Maureen Silva. You can find my information on our website, but here it is just in case, as well as my colleague, Laquana Williams. Thank you again for participating and watching this webinar. We hope that you enjoyed it, and please feel free to contact us if you have any questions.